Well, what's up, Preaching While Black fam? Listen, I got a great guest for this episode. Dr. Carolyn Gordon is going to be joining us. She is a chair of mass communications at Mississippi Valley State. She actually taught me at Fuller Seminary through our communications and preaching department. We're going to talk about preaching, talk about what it means to be a woman preacher, and also talk about the Southern Baptist and National Baptist Convention. You don't want to miss this. See y'all soon.
Welcome to the Preaching While Black podcast, a podcast dedicated to the calling, craft, and content of the Black preaching tradition. And now, here's your host, John C. Richards Jr.
Well, hello, Dr. Gordon. How's it going?
Hello, and Happy New Year to you.
Same to you, my seminary professor. I remember you at Fuller Seminary teaching my communications class and giving us the business.
You know what? Let me tell you something.
For those of you who don't know, Dr. Gordon is ordained by both the Southern Baptist and National Baptist Conventions. We're going to talk about that. But she has over a decade of pastoral experience during which she preaches regularly. So she is a preacher's preacher. I love her communication style. I love her preaching, and that's why I want to have her on the show. Currently, she serves as associate professor and chair of the mass communications department at Mississippi Valley State University, HBCU. Let's go. She is taught at Fuller Theological Seminary as an associate professor of communications and preaching, chair in the Department of Preaching, and she has a BA in journalism from University of Missouri, a lot of master's degrees from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, right, and a PhD in human communication studies from Howard University in Washington, D.C. She actually just contributed to a fan fiction book called The Death of Cliff Huxtable. I'm interested to hear about that. And she's doing a lot of work around social media as the third eye of the church. Right. So we're going to talk about some of that in this episode, but I want to start with your call, especially your call as a woman in ministry. When did you first sense your call to pastoral ministry, Dr. Gordon?
You know what? Honestly, I never, ever really had a call to so much pastoral ministry as it was to preaching. And very clear about that. And it has been helpful because as a preacher, and understanding that was my call, I get to float more than if I'm called to pastoral ministries and got to look for that position. But my journey is an interesting one, but probably one you've heard before. I love Jesus. I was one of them Jesus kids. I was in Youth for Christ in high school. In fact, I was a president of Youth for Christ in high school. I tried to be holy, and my prom date ended up running my Pentecostal prom date ended up running off with another one because I was too holy to dance. Okay, I love Jesus. Okay. And so anyway, when I went off to college, I ended up in an organization, Black Christian Fellowship, which was a part of Southern Baptist Student Union. So I've always had this God consciousness and love for God and love for the church. Didn't particularly want to preach. I was raised in a very conservative, silk stocking, mega church now by that standards, during a time where women didn't preach, especially in a Baptist church, and we were taught women didn't preach. And honestly, I didn't know not to agree with it because I, as a woman, never wanted to preach. So we could be missionaries, but we couldn't preach. So this is where the plot thickens, because while I was in college, it spent time, again, like at the Black Christian Fellowship, which is a part of the Baptist Student Union, which is also Southern Baptist. In the summer, I worked with Southern Baptist as a summer missionary. So the 4 years of college every summer, and then I spent a semester abroad in Taiwan. So I did the missions work, right? And I did that because I love Jesus, and that's what women did who were missionaries. So anyway, when I finished school, and this is all relevant, I finished undergrad, and I didn't know what I was going to do next. I knew I wanted a master's degree, to be honest. I didn't know what. I had just finished a semester missions assignment in Taiwan. I came back, I graduated college. There was a youth conference that summer, and I was asked to speak 5 minutes on my trip to Taiwan. After I stepped off the stage, I was approached and asked, do you want to go to seminary? We will give you a job and a scholarship. Okay. Well, I had no other plans at the time, and I knew I wanted a master's. So why not? Divine setup, John. Because honestly, I didn't even know what a seminary really did. So imagine my surprise when people come to know, so are you going to preach? Well, why are you asking me that? I'm getting a master's degree. So what? I happen to be in the MDiv program. You know, that was just one of those, I didn't have peace about any of the program. So, but God was working otherwise. Because my pastor that I grew up with, loved, and adored, he taught us women didn't preach. He retired. And then, okay, so Reverend Dr. John W. Williams, who is just, I claim as my father ministry, and before he died, he claimed me. But he just taught women didn't preach. He was raised that way. So then when Reverend Dr. Mac Charles Jones came, where I say Dr. Williams came with the peace, came with a peace symbol, the dove. Mac came with the sword. Okay. Seriously, he was hired by the church when our pastor retired. Now, so, Reverend Williams was the first Black man on the Billy Graham crusade, very much into evangelism, very much into living righteously and doing it right. And then you had Mac, who came from some part of Georgia where he was known for fighting the Ku Klux Klan at the time. So he was an absolute activist. And because of that, he also believed greatly in justice, and the call of a woman to preach. So in the meanwhile, being in Black Christian Fellowship in college and doing all the summer missions work, I knew God was calling me to something. So then one day Max said, is God calling you to preach? Well, my answer is yes, no, maybe, I don't know. All of the above. So make a long story short, I'm in seminary. I transferred to Texas because they had a master's in communication as well as theology. Okay, so I ended up doing those two first. And in the process, God started dealing with me. I took an adult psychology, religion psychology class. And the pivotal moment was when we had to type up, and we were typing at the time, that's how old I am, a paper on a reflection paper. One of the questions, what is the conversation you've been having the most? And it was women in ministry. At that time, it was very controversial. Southern Baptists had come out against it. In fact, in Kansas City conference, voted not to support the ordination of women. And so then the next question was why? And before I knew it, I typed, because I feel called to ministry and I don't know what to do. Okay. That's why I always encourage people to journal. You find out things about yourself when you give your soul's permission to write. So I struggled with it the whole summer, and I came back to Kansas City. At that time, another woman had announced her call to preach at my home church, so they were having a town meeting about it because the pastor was trying to.
They called a meeting?
They had a town meeting. So, and I just happened to get in town the day before. I went to the meeting. All was well. No one knew what I had been just dealing with that summer. My pastor, he sensed it, but you have to come to it for yourself. So in the midst of it, finally, it came down to, God, I can't do this anymore. So my prayer was, if I get out of this church without officially announcing my call, I'm going to believe you're not calling me. Because in our tradition, you had to announce your call. You had to walk the aisle and say, God is calling me to preach. And so I said, if I get out of the church tonight, not doing it, I'm going to believe you're not calling me. Well, the organist started playing the benediction, and Max stopped the organist and said, I'm sorry. Is there anyone here who needs to make a statement before the Lord tonight? And I got up and walked before the church, and I couldn't say anything. I just sobbed. And he just said, Carolyn's been struggling with her call for a long time. Well, everything went up. Oh, God, so much mayhem happened. And because the problem was, I was from there. I was born and raised there. They knew me. The other lady, they didn't know, they didn't like, so it was no issue. But now you have this investment of their daughter. You know, I'm the one that they gave the peppermints to in the halls, in the choir. I'm the one that they taught in Sunday school. They taught in BTU, Baptist Training Union at the time. I'm the one they slipped the $2 and $3 and $5 to when I went off to college. Okay. So, and I remember in our newsletter, the pastor wrote, he said, we're at a point where we're faced with a decision to make.
Right.
Because if you can't stone the other woman without stoning your own daughter. Okay. So anyway, I almost split the church. He got in trouble. He got kicked out of the ministerial lines of Kansas City, Missouri. So that's what happened. I was in seminary at the time. I was working at a Southern Baptist church, to get to your question. And so the pastor got up one Sunday and just announced, if I'm not here, Reverend Gordon's in charge. She's the associate pastor. Okay. There was no initial conversation with me.
That's how it happens.
That's how it happens. And so, so my sister said to me, if you're going to be in charge of anything, you need to be ordained, which again, I had to inch my own way through this journey because it was such a new, it was trailblazing and I didn't know it. Okay. It never dawned on me that I had to get ordained. And I think it was kind of taken out of my hands when the pastor made the announcement. And so the pastor said, we need to ordain you. Well, going back to Kansas City, because I was in Texas, my church, National Baptist Church, Reverend Dr., we call him Mac, but it's Dr. Mac Charles Jones. He said, but we want to ordain you. Okay, so that's how I ended up with 2 ordinations, because what happened, the churches came together. Kansas City actually flew and drove down to Texas, Fort Worth, Texas, where I was there. And they both agreed to license and ordain. Well, St. Stephen's licensed me, but both churches agreed to ordain me, one Southern Baptist, one National Baptist. So
now speaking of Southern Baptist,
so I was with 2 bitches that didn't want me.
I need to ask you this question because this is this has been pressing on my heart here before we turn to the crafts, because as you're working on a master's program at Southwestern as a Black woman at a Southern Baptist seminary, like how did that factor into you discerning your call, or how did you have any difficulties with the Southern Baptist?
You know what? That actually had no bearing on my call, because honestly, looking back, my call was already my call. That's how I ended up in seminary in the first place, not knowing it. But the thing about it, and I'll share this honestly with you. I remember me and there was another woman who we're still friends today. We were standing out discussing our schedules. And both of us were in a preaching class. And one of the professors, and understand, let me just say this up front, there were no Black professors at Southwestern at the time. And the only female professor was the children's ministry professor. Okay.
Wow.
The professor standing there said, you're in the preaching class, and he called out the professor's name. He said, both of you, and he started laughing. And what he said was, I would like to see that professor's face when he see you 2 Black women sitting up in his class.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. Wow. But the professor in question was very supportive. But what I learned from that, John, is that, because I even had another conversation with my Baptist history professor after I gave a presentation or testimony, something in front of the chapel, he said, Carolyn, you have such a gift. And I said, okay, but what do I do with it? And he said, I don't know. If you were a man, I'd tell you you'd be a pastor. But you're a woman, I don't know. When I got ordained, it made the Fort Worth Star-Telegram news. So, but you know, let me,
you're out here making news.
Let me for a moment and say, that's why you've got to trust God with the creativity of what God intended for you. Because if we trust the imagination of those around us, they're limited by what they know. They're limited by what they can imagine. But as you see, God saw fit for more. I couldn't even imagine it. And so when I was at Southwestern, because basically, as a Black woman, for the most part, I was not relevant, John, which was okay. You know why it was okay? That's how I ended up with 3 masters from there. Nobody paid attention to me.
Flew under the
I was
radar.
under the radar. And let me tell you something. People, complain and get upset because they're overlooked, ignored, or not acknowledged. Let me tell you, that means you have the football. You can make as many touchdowns as you want. It's only when people start recognizing you and knowing you do you have people who try to fight against your progress.
Yeah. Wow. So that certainly speaks to your call. I want to talk about your craft here after the break. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to talk about the craft of your preaching.
Okay.
Scholars have referred to the original Black church as the invisible institution because enslaved people were often not allowed to worship freely. They'd have to gather, sing, and preach in secret to avoid being beaten. Yet they still developed a deep devotion to the authority of Scripture and the liberation narrative. Today, many Christians who don't fully agree with conservatives or progressives feel invisible. They're not well represented in politics or mainstream media. In response, the AND campaign has created the Invisible Institution newsletter, or IVI. We'll be providing political commentary, policy breakdowns, and more for Christians who believe in social justice and moral order, not one or the other. Go to andcampaign.org and subscribe if you're sick and tired of feeling invisible.
So, Dr. Gordon, you have a PhD in Human Communication Studies from Howard University, the real HU.
Yeah.
Yes, there you go. How has knowing communications helped you in the craft of your sermon preparation, and how might pastors become better communicators besides taking that communications class like I took at Fuller?
Which is only 10 weeks. Okay, we needed a part 2. But I think that's an excellent question because we don't fully, when people hear you say, I majored in communication, people automatically think that, oh, that's a blow-off field, right? Because since everybody does it, we assume that we know how to do it and that we know how to do it effectively. I don't judge people on are they good or bad, but are they effective? And so as a human communication studies, because I realized between my broadcasting journalism background and human communication studies, sandwiched with the theology and the religious education, what it did, it gave me a holistic approach to what communication is about and how preaching is an extension of that communication. So if you understand the effectiveness of communication, then you understand that I don't care how many people jump and stand on pews and shout and clap while or during or after you're preaching. If they cannot tell you what you've preached about, from my standpoint, then you have not preached.
Tell it. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
So the theatrics and all that means very little if they can't tell you the substance of what you preach.
But now, if that is their goal, to get people on their feet or to get people on the floor, if that is their goal, then they can say, I did good because they reached their goal. But as a committed, called person to preach, then I have that responsibility to speak on behalf of God to the people of God, right? And in prayer, we speak on behalf of the people of God to God. And once we understand the power of that communication, John, we don't take it so lightly. And I'm guilty because, in worship leading, in every part of it, we rank it. If you preaching, you are the cream of the crop. If you on the program
That's
just to give the prayer, you know what I'm saying, or to read the scriptures, the only problem is, let me tell you, I have so many lessons I've learned the hard way. I remember I got a call. A woman had joined our church when I was in Chapel Oaks, Maryland. I was an assistant pastor there. And she called me about 4 months later. And she said, Reverend Gordon, you don't know this, but I need to tell you. The day I came to your church, I had planned to commit suicide after I left.
Wow.
And she said, your prayer saved my life and changed my life. Now, John, that was
not the
for
sermon
me because I didn't remember anything about the prayer. Okay, you know what I'm saying? But I got served notice. We take nothing. Every time you get a chance to speak, it's an opportunity to change the world, at least a part of it, or to change someone. If we understand the power of the spoken word, and so the study of communication and the study of preaching and experience has afforded me that to finally say we take nothing for granted. If we're going to do the benediction, speak a good word, then do that benediction and mean it. If you're going to read the scriptures, don't just open the Bible, pick a passage and go for it. It should have been practiced and understood. The Lord is my shepherd is a whole sermon right there. The Lord is my shepherd. And so as a communication person and human communication studies person, to answer your question, it challenges me to always try to communicate at the necessary and required effectiveness to get your message across.
I've seen you do an amazing job of connecting with your audience. I remember watching a message that you preached at Biola out in California and just connecting with those young adults and those young students. You had them hooked from the beginning. You put your hooks in them and they were leaning in and ready to go. So when crafting your sermon, how much do you think about those who you're communicating with as you're putting that together?
You know what? In crafting my sermon, the first thing is, God, what you want? What do you want to tell them? What do you want for this group? Okay.
Yeah.
It was James Massey, who gave a lecture at Southwestern on the inwardness, the outwardness, and the eventfulness of preaching. So the prayer for me is always first, what do you want? What do you want for your people? Then the question becomes, and what do we want to happen? Okay, because the challenge is, if you're going to preach, expect something. Okay, the prayer is hopefully to be surprised. But you know what? You should expect something. And so I get calls a lot from my clergy friends working on a sermon. And so one in particular, I know. When do I ask? We start to say, every time, what is it, what do you want? What is the message you want to get to the people? And what should be the people's response? Okay. So as I think about it and just, I take a look at a lot of things. I always look at their theme. I believe in honoring the theme, especially since I'm bivocational in a sense. I get invited to a lot of special occasions or conferences or, I look at their theme because for me, as their guest, their theme tells a lot about who they are or where they're trying to go.
Yeah.
When I don't and I'm just invited, what is the Holy Spirit whispering? Okay. So then the next question is, who are these people? And this is just a tip. When I get invited to a church, first of all, I try to find out who the people are. If I get invited to a conference, and this is the communication part, right? Know your audience. Rule number 1. So I scour. I look at websites. I look at the church websites. I look at their whole social media presence. I try to get a feel for who this is. Who are these people? There are times where I've actually looked up the histories of their cities or read the news, what's going on in the cities. What's the environment? What are we working with? Or in the case of the Biola, there was a committee. I talked to them. What is it that you perceive? What do you want to happen through this conference? Okay. And so then I try to work in that purview.
That's good. That's good. So before we turn to the content of your preaching, if you had to provide people with 2 resources that you use every time you prepare your sermons, what are those 2
the Bible is number 1. Yeah, I won't throw that out there.
Listen, you so spiritual. You so deep.
I'm so Christian. The Bible is number 1. But number 2, no, John, you know what? I've been doing this for a minute, right? So when I first started, of course, it was the International Critical Commentary. And I listened to some other things. Now, let me tell you what I do now.
Go on.
of course, the Bible is still the Bible, but I don't use just one anymore. Let's take a look at it from this perspective. In my last presentation on the Malachi Mandate, I literally went and listened to rabbis' sermons and lectures. Okay.
Wow.
Right. And see, so now, and especially with the advent of so much digital information, I scour, and in fact, this is just another tip. Even in sermon preparation, if I have the title of my sermon, I Google my own title. You know how we think we're so creative? You will find 12,000 people already preached it in some kind of way. I listen to their sermons. Let's see where they're going with this. How did they approach this? What kind of background information? And then from taking notes, if it's something I didn't know, then I go and look it up. So my sermons are very research oriented and research based, and I use several different commentaries just based on who I'm preaching to and what's the content of the sermon and what's the goal. Is it topical? Is it expository? Yeah. What are we doing here? And so I do it based on that. So I would start with the Bible and read it. Forget just the pericope, although it seems the pericope has become a thing of the past. But I try to read at least the chapters before and after. But again, it just depends. I've read the whole book. If you're coming from Ephesians, what's Ephesians back? Let's go back and look at that. So that's part of mine. But I have to do it that way because of my form of delivery. Okay. And so I don't do manuscript when I preach. So I have all these notes that I have to ingest and then come up with my outline.
That's good. So we've talked about your call, and we've talked about the crafts of your preaching. When we come back, we're going to talk about the content of your preaching. I'm looking forward to it.
What's up, Preaching While Black fam? Listen, I hope this interview has been a blessing so far. If you want more content and resources around Preaching While Black, go over to our YouTube channel, Preaching While Black. We have all the episodes from our interviews up, but we also have other resources for you as a Black preacher as you try to hone your craft, your call, and your content for Black preaching. Now back to our episode.
Hey, so Dr. Gordon, you have a production background too, and have produced several television shows in the past. So as someone who has that kind of experience, have you seen any overlap in the storytelling that you've done there and the storytelling that you bring to your preaching task?
You know what? Yes and no, because what happens, and especially in the production aspect of even television or radio, the question becomes, and I think that goes back to my preaching and how I can do an outline sermon, because there's always, how are you going to tell the story? What form are you going to use? And how are you going to organize it? Okay. So that whole idea of how do you paint the picture? But let me go back to James Massey though. James Massey, and you know what, this is funny, but as a university professor, we have lectures all the time. Let me tell you, I actually listened to that series when I was at Southwestern. Okay, so I'm going to own it. Y'all don't give up on students because we're listening when you don't think we're listening. He talked to me again about the inwardness, the outwardness, and the eventfulness of preaching. And in the whole ideal of expecting something to happen, he talked about how you have to walk the streets of the text. You have to
That's good.
Feel the feels, smell the smells, hear the sounds. And so in understanding that, then when it comes to sermon preparation, again, what do you want to happen in the hearts and the minds of the people? What experience will you give them? What will they feel? What will they see? What will they hear? So then that goes to the embodiment of the sermon. What does it sound like? I wrote that article on maintenance of the preaching voice, the vocal hygiene. What does your voice sound like? How do you paint the picture if they were blind? How do you paint the picture if they were deaf? And so, because we're in competition with the whole world, we're in competition with social media. If you notice now, in many or most of the churches, while you're preaching, people are even have digital Bibles. But I know I was sitting next to a friend of mine, and I was annoyed that she kept texting through the whole sermon until I found out she was texting. She literally was posting the notes to the sermon.
And the notes.
Points.
Yeah.
Right. Not only that, but guess what? Now, while you're preaching, people are Googling and researching what you're saying.
You better get it right.
You know, right? Exactly. That goes back to the research. But so why should they listen to you? Why should they listen?
Yeah, that's good.
Uh-huh.
So, Dr. Gordon, I want to ask you this. Some people would say keep social justice, politics, and policy out of the pulpit. How would you respond to those folks?
Jesus was social media. Jesus was social justice. Jesus was political, and not in the sense of vote for A or B, but in the sense that justice and the demand for justice is political. And I didn't realize this as much as, to be honest, when I did this last lectureship on the Micah mandate and how that whole concept of let justice roll down was basically an indictment from God. We were having a court here because they were not doing what God has called them to do. And if you read that passage, a lot of people were called out, including the preachers who were preaching for money, who were preaching to those preaching what people wanted to hear. Okay, go back and read it. It's a beautiful. The Old Testament is underrated, but the whole notion that we've got to be. Let me turn this a bit. If we can't preach social justice and politics, and what's the other one?
Policy.
Might as well add religion in there too, because we can't preach religion anymore. But then what are we supposed to preach?
Yeah, it's a good question. But there are some folks out there, including your good Southern Baptist friends, who believe that
but I don't know.
Justice should be.
You know what, John? Let me say, when people tell me that, just ask the question. So, what are we supposed to preach? So, because I've had students who've been kicked out of churches. Okay, because the church said they talked about Jesus too much. I've had people I know kicked out of churches because whenever we say you got to do right by people, whether it's black, white issue, whether it's a gay, straight issue, whether it's interracial marriage, whatever the issues are, I know there are churches who believe Jesus was a Republican. Okay. I know churches who believe that, just name one and pick it. But this is the thing. Either we're going to preach on behalf of the God who called us, or we're not. And if we stay away from all the parts of the Bible that makes people uncomfortable, we're limited to what? Psalms 23, maybe?
That brings great comfort to a lot of people.
You know what I'm saying? Until you preach it too many times, and then they will complain about that. And see, I heard it was said that effective preaching either brings a revival or a revolution. Okay.
Yeah.
And so people revolt. They will revolt. If they don't want to hear about justice, then at some point they're going to revolt. And I think the call for us is to be true to what we've been called to. Like I said earlier, I was not called to pastor. That's just not my calling. I can do it, but I'm not called to that. And until God says, this is where I want you. But I believe the pulpit is changing anyway. And our message is going to have to get out of the church at some point. So one thing about teaching at HBCU And I love it because every time a student walk into my office, I can do justice. I can show mercy. I can love kindness.
Good.
I get to do that. And so we've got to preach the message we've been called to preach. They're not all pretty. They're not all comfortable. I believe different people are called to different messages. Okay, not everybody is evangelistic. They're called to share the gospel, but not everybody is called to be that evangelist. Not everybody is called to be that prophet, okay, or to be that justice keeper, And so that's how we get into trouble. When you look at Jeremiah had a direct call on his head. You got to preach what I tell you to preach. You got to build, you got to tear down. Some of the other prophets were preaching at the time, all is as well as Zion. And Jeremiah had to say, no, it's not. No. And so we're called to different things, and we've got to honor that and not be pressured either way.
Man, this has been such a rich conversation, Dr. Gordon, and I know people are going to benefit from it. And I appreciate you for joining me on this call. And I'm glad that we talked about Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary being the ordained Southern Baptist and National Baptist. You just a chameleon out here in these streets. I appreciate you.
John, thank you. I hope that we accomplished what you wanted to accomplish in the conversation. And if not, if you'd like me back, I'll come.
All right.
That's
Sounds
fair?
good. Looking forward. Yep. Looking forward to it. Thank you all for joining us on this episode. We look forward to you joining us next go round.
Thanks for listening to the Preaching While Black podcast. For more helpful content and resources, connect with us online at preachingwhileblack.com.